Leaders from around the world are in New York for the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and there's a lot to get through. It's known as High Level Week, and for Australia's part, recognising Palestinian statehood, announcing a new climate target, and showcasing our world-first social media ban for children under 16 years old are just a few items on the agenda. Not to mention looking to lock in a meeting with President Trump. In this Squiz Shortcut, we're going to take you through the role of the UN, what's happening in High Level Week, so you'll be across a big week in news, and what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese hopes to achieve there. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Larissa Moore.
And I'm Andrew Williams.
Andrew, there's been a big build-up to this United Nations, or UN as we'll call it, going through this shortcut, to this General Assembly. It feels like we've been talking about it for ages. And when I say we, I mean you and Alice on the Squiz Today podcast.
Yeah, we've been talking about it a bunch, especially in light of a few of the big world-shaping items that are on the agenda at the moment, like working on a solution in the Israel-Palestine conflict and also setting new climate targets. So the General Assembly started on the 8th of September, but this week is a big one. It's known as High Level Week.
Yeah, so that's when the leaders of the member states come together. Our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will be there. He'll be addressing the Assembly tomorrow night, so Wednesday night. There's pressure building on him to lock in a meeting with President Trump while he's over there. We'll get into that in a second. But before we do that, let's do what we always do, which is a quick refresher on the basics, the role of the UN, and why this year, its 80th year, is a big one.
There have been some big 80th anniversaries this year because of the end of World War II and commemorating that. And that's notable because the United Nations was created in the aftermath of that war. The world had just experienced a devastating loss of life, infrastructure and money, and leaders at the time wanted to prevent another global conflict like that from happening again.
I've got a lofty quote from UN's Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. He put it, 80 years ago, from the ashes of war, the world planted a seed of hope. One charter, one vision, one promise, that peace is possible when humanity stands together. So that's the idea. That's the idea to have an international body where countries can come together, they can talk things through, and ideally resolve disputes before they get to war.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that after World War I, they had a crack at this sort of thing. The League of Nations was established, but that alliance wasn't enough to prevent a Second World War, of course, from breaking out. So in forming the UN, member countries designed it to be stronger than that. They had actual peacekeeping forces in place to try and maintain peace and stability wherever things might be getting a little bit shaky.
Pretty much every country in the world has a seat at the table, 193 member states and 2 non-member observer states. That's Vatican City and Palestine. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Palestine later. But the fact that all these countries come together every year for the world's town hall, it's important.
Yeah, it gives them an equal chance to have a voice in global affairs, equal depending on who you ask and what matters to them. And 80 years is quite a milestone to reach, although the UN does have its fair share of critics. When I was doing high school debating, we were debating the effectiveness of the UN, even in the early 2000s. That has been an ongoing discussion for a long period of time. And there are still wars going on in the world. And although the UN has condemned the actions of some of the countries in those wars, that condemnation hasn't always had the desired effect.
I also remember high school debating and is the UN a toothless tiger question.
It's a classic. Yeah.
Let's take a look at what it actually does. At the most visible level, you've got the General Assembly. So that's what's going on in New York at the moment. That's where every member state gets a vote and a voice, and leaders use it to lay out their positions on global issues.
Yeah, and then there's the Security Council, which is smaller but more powerful. So it's made up of 15 members, 5 of which are permanent, and they are the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. Some pretty big players in that group. And they have veto power, which is one of the most controversial parts of the UN system because it means that they can block any resolution, which is a resolution is like a formal decision or statement about some sort of issue that the UN body like the General Assembly might make. And that has led to accusations that the UN is essentially ineffective in responding to major global crises and conflicts because of the amount of power that those permanent members have.
Examples of that veto power in action that are super relevant right now. Russia has repeatedly used it to block resolutions condemning its invasion of Ukraine. Another example, the US has vetoed resolutions that are critical of Israel over its conduct in the war against Hamas in Gaza and against Palestinians. So, yeah, 2 pretty big examples right there.
And then beyond the big sort of geopolitical section of the UN and what the countries individually want, the UN also has sort of a more functional role in running dozens of specialised humanitarian agencies that you might have heard of. UNICEF, that's around children, the WHO, the World Health Organization for Health, UNHCR for refugees, and the World Food Programme are just a few. So, yeah, some really sort of big tasks that it's taken on.
Yeah, the day-to-day humanitarian work of the UN is massive. We mentioned peacekeepers before. They're known as blue helmets. We often hear about them being sent into conflict zones.
You might be wondering how often that happens. They've been sent into conflict zones in more than 70 operations throughout the decades, so relatively often. And another big role of the UN is setting international agreements and treaties for the planet. So think, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that happened in 1948, or the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015.
The treaties don't always have teeth, but they create a direction that countries can work towards, as we're doing with climate commitments. New emissions targets under the Paris Agreement are going to be discussed this week, and we'll talk about those and some of the other things on the high-level week agenda coming up next. Andrew, as far as international affairs go, there's a lot going on in the world right now. So while this meeting of leaders and diplomats at the UN General Assembly happens every year, eyes really are on this one: who's going, what'll be said, and the outcomes. The theme this year is Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development and human rights.
Nice for the UN to pick a Jack Johnson song to choose as their theme.
Sure, that was right on their mind.
I'm sure that was right at the top. So over the course of the week, leaders will take to the podium in the Assembly Hall to address their peers. So speeches are limited to 15 minutes, but there's also a bunch of meetings that happen on the side. There are bilateral talks and conferences on specific issues. So, for example, one of those conferences will be to continue working on a framework for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. Another is on climate commitments, and there's also one about the ethical dilemmas posed by artificial intelligence.
Just on Palestine, Australia has now joined more than 150 nations, including the UK, France and Canada this week, in supporting an independent Palestinian state. That's a major diplomatic shift for Western allies of Israel.
Yeah, the PM made that announcement after he landed in New York on Sunday. It's a landmark moment in Australian foreign policy because we're going against our traditional friend and ally in the US. Now, making things a bit awkward is that at the same time, Albanese is also trying to lock in a meeting with US President Donald Trump while he's there, and Trump and his government, his administration, have been openly critical of that position on Palestine.
And, of course, there's no love lost between Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu and Albanese after our announcement about Palestine. He's a key ally of Trump's.
And Trump and Albanese have actually never met face-to-face. And so Albanese's been under a lot of pressure to make this meeting, while both of them are the leaders of their respective countries, happen, especially given that the US is currently reviewing our AUKUS security agreement with both the US, ourselves, and the UK. So he'll want to make sure that it goes well to try and lock that in. And you might remember that there was a meeting that was lined up to happen during the G7 in June, but it fell through when Trump left early.
Yeah, of course. They have talked on the phone. They've had 4 phone calls. There has been communication, but analysts and the world that watches our relationship with the US say the fact that an invitation to the White House hasn't happened yet is concerning. They say that the assumption has been that given America's focus on tamping down China's influence and Australia's location in the Indo-Pacific, that it'd be making sure that relations with us continue to be friendly. That's the assumption.
And one of those experts that spoke about that was the Executive Director of Australia's Lowy Institute, Michael Fullerlove, who says that our diplomatic ties with the US are presently quite thin and that Albanese needed to make it a priority to try and thicken them up. So some have pointed to the PM's agenda at the UN as a possible indicator of why we might be low on Trump's to-meet list.
Too thin and thicken them up sounds like a white sauce you're trying to cook.
A roux.
Yeah, exactly. So Albanese will be presenting our new climate target of reducing emissions by 62 to 70% by 2035. Trump has pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, so it's not something he's interested in.
And then add to that, the PM will also be hosting a forum where he'll go through our plans to ban social media for children under the age of 16, which is going to hold US tech giants responsible for policing their platforms. And again, that won't win us points with Trump because of the impact or potential impact on American business. And then add to that, there's our stance on Palestine.
Other leaders in the world, such as UK PM Keir Starmer, they've taken the same position as us. Trump hasn't been nearly as critical. He simply said last week during a state visit to the UK that he disagreed with Starmer on the issue of Palestine.
So, as whether this will happen or not, reports say Albanese's team is working overtime to secure a meeting with Trump. Meanwhile, Turkey's president, Tayyip Erdogan, has scored an invitation to the White House this week. And that is an interesting thing to note because Turkey is our main rival in our bid to host the UN's climate summit, which is called COP31 next year, along with the Pacific Islands. And Turkey is refusing to bow out of that race and leave it to Australia.
We have talked a bit about this. There's a lot riding on our bid for COP31. We did a shortcut on it called Australia's Climate Showdown. So if you want to find that specific one, just search for that. Squiz Shortcuts, Australia's Climate Showdown, if you want to know a bit more about it. But essentially, it's key to our energy transition and worth a lot of investment dollars for us. So it's something that Albanese is going to be lobbying pretty hard for this week, amongst all of the other things that are on the agenda at High Level Week. That is our shortcut, as I said, to High Level Week at the UN. Now, each week we give Squiz's recommendations for further reading, watching and listening on the topic. I am recommending a UN paper called What to Know Ahead of the UN Summit and the Question of Palestine. It's very handy in prepping for this shortcut. Yes. Gets you across in a bit more detail about what's up for discussion this week.
And if you want to get sort of a broader overview of the UN, we've got a short video that has been produced by the UN, so just keep that in mind when you're watching it. But it's about its 80th anniversary and the organisation's role in the world more generally.
So maybe if you're a high school student prepping for your debate this year, you can check some of these out.
Two very handy pieces of media.
Links, as always, to those are in the episode notes. Usually right now we'd put a call out for a topic for shortcuts, but actually we've got our regular Ask the Squiz podcast session that you and Claire do each month, where we take questions that might not be big enough for a full shortcut episode or following up on a story that's covered in the news, and you might want a bit of a roundup of that. If you have a question for us to ask the Squiz, shoot it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au, and Andrew, you and Claire will answer those questions on Thursday.
Yep, some of our most fascinating topics come from you and directly what you want us to talk about. So please get in touch, whether it's a big story like the UN or a little one, a minor one that you're just curious about. They're all good. We love to hear from you.
It's like a challenge to come up with something an extra curly question to get you.
Yeah, and if it's, the more kind of minor that it might sound, the more interesting it might end up being. So go
fun.
for it. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Until next time.